Welcome to the Tech Pathfinder podcast, where we explore the impact of technology on the people in your workplace. Hello and welcome to the Tech Pathfinder podcast, where we explore the impact of technology on people in the workplace. I'm your host, JP, and today we're going to be diving into the positive duty legislation that was brought into Australia in late 2022. We'll explore the impacts of this legislation on businesses and employees and what you can be doing in your workplace to ensure you not only meet these requirements, but also do so in a safe and supportive way for your people. Before we jump in, let me introduce my guest for today's discussion, Tym Lawrence. Tym is Head of Customer Excellence for RepSafe, where he advises Australian organisations on how they can introduce measures to track and manage workplace incidents like sexual harassment and discrimination. For the last decade, Tym has run solutions consulting teams for a number of enterprise software companies, much like myself. He has a fantastic grasp on the HR software space. From his years at working at Sum Total Systems, which is now part of the Cornerstone On Demand suite. Tym, welcome and thank you.
Thanks, JP. Great to be here. Really appreciate it.
Excellent. So I talked about the positive duty and what that means. Let's take a step back and look at the history of it and understand a little bit of the background. Can you tell us where positive duty came from?
Sure. I guess you could probably start at things like the Me Too movements and similar movements, and they really exploded in 2016, 2017, and brought to awareness and at sort of global level discussions around sexual harassment and gender inequality. In June of 2018, Australia's Sex Discrimination Commissioner announced a national inquiry into sexual harassment in Australian workplaces. And look, there really was, and there clearly is, a problem that needs to be addressed. Around that same time in 2018, the Australian Human Rights Commission did, in their national survey, found that 1 in 3 people had experienced sexual harassment at work over a 5-year period. The Respect at Work report was released in March of 2020. And it found that the then current legal and regulatory system really wasn't fit for purpose. And it put forward a new model that was evidence-based, victim-focused, and framed through gender and intersectional lenses. Now, the recommendations of the Commission have been legislated at the Commonwealth level through, think of it as the Respect at Work Act. Its full name was the Anti-Discrimination and Human Rights Legislation Amendment. And it amended the Sex Discrimination Act of 1984. You see there's my lawyer background coming out. I did do law at university. I've never really practiced, so I'm not a lawyer. But importantly, the legislation had this positive duty on employers and, in fact, anyone conducting a business, a person conducting a business or undertaking, a PCBU. We'll just call them employers. And there's this duty to eliminate workplace sexual discrimination harassment. They labelled it just generally as unlawful conduct. So if we say unlawful conduct, that's what it is. It's sex discrimination harassment. And that law came into force in December 2022. Now, Australian businesses have until December of this year, 2023, to comply with these new laws, or else they can face penalties and, reputational and financial damages. I think that's about the background for it.
So the legislation came in about 9 months now. It's been in for a while. Organisations still have a little while, December this year, to get their act together and get things happening. Has anything happened in the time since that legislation has passed? We've seen, some scandals still happening with some organisations where it's fairly obvious that they've not had this sort of thing in place. What's changed in the last 9 months?
Look, honestly, I'm not sure a lot has changed. Obviously in the years before the legislation, we saw lots of stories, and this is, only in the last year or two, we saw stories of toxic workplaces in Australian Federal Parliament, New South Wales Parliament, Labor Party, Opera Australia, Sony Music. They're just some examples that spring to mind. And look, I don't really think a lot has changed. Not really. We're still seeing stories of bullying, harassment, and assault in the press across multiple sectors: health, education, defence, consulting. I mean, just recently, and when I say recently, we're talking 5 or 6, a couple of weeks ago now, the Sydney Morning Herald reported on the culture of bullying, racism, and sexual harassment in the large consulting firms. Now, these are the same ones going through other scandals as well. But in July, an independent review of EY's workplace culture found that 15% of their current and former female employees that had responded to the survey had experienced sexual harassment over the last 5 years. And 17% had been bullied. And that's in one of the most respectable consulting firms in the country. So I think there's still a long way to go. Frankly, it gives me pause.
Yeah, so let's take a step back so we understand what positive duty itself is, because in first reading it, it seems like something that you would expect the organisations are doing already, and they may well be doing so to an extent. But what exactly is positive duty?
Yeah, so I guess in its simplest terms, the positive duty requires employers, businesses, organisations to take, in brackets or in quotation marks, reasonable and proportional steps to eliminate this unlawful conduct in the workplace as far as possible. And really, the big shift here is we're moving from being reactive to being proactive. We actually have an obligation to prevent workplace harassment and discrimination rather than responding after it occurs. So, if I was going to summarize it, employers, we've always wanted employers, and employers should take allegations of bullying and harassment seriously, take action. But now they have a proactive duty to take steps to create a more safe, more respectful, more inclusive workplace.
So what are the implications then if this shift is now to the proactive aspect of it, which we're seeing a lot in other spaces within employee well-being, mental health support. We're seeing a shift to that proactive action, that proactive step, rather than being reactive. What are the implications of positive duty for Australian organisations as of as you said, December this year? What are the implications?
Yeah, they're good question. Look, the first thing I'd actually point out, and this is really important for anyone listening who goes, "This doesn't apply to me." Well, that's not true. These obligations apply to every organisation and business in Australia, regardless of your size or resources. So small businesses, sole practitioners, you have to deliver on this positive duty as well. And if you don't, right, if you fail to comply with the Respect at Work Act, you can be held liable for any incidents of harassment or discrimination that occur in the workplace. And under the Sex Discrimination Act, there is no cap to the financial penalties and damages. There's also the Work Health and Safety Act, and there are fines there, depending on what state you're in, but generally they're over 1.5 million. So these are not small penalties. Now, if you want to get more information on what you need to do, the first place I would go would be the Australian Human Rights Commission website. They've got a number of useful resources and fact sheets, and I'll make sure we have that link in the episode notes. But if I was going to summarise it, so the short version is that the Commission, the Human Rights Commission, expects all organisations to have some measures in place to address their 7 standards. That is leadership, culture, knowledge, risk management, support, reporting and response, and monitoring, evaluation, and transparency. There are standards on each of those. Their website has a nice little diagram, but those are where you've got to do something under each of those.
And I think the standards are great because it provides a framework for how you address it as an organisation. It's not just a matter of, okay, you now need to be proactive about this. It's more, you need to be proactive about this, but here are the standards, and these are these are the things that you're expected to do as an organisation. Yeah. Let's jump into the standards a little bit more, so we can understand what exactly organisations need to be doing.
Sure. And look, if it helps, I kind of think of them as in 2 groups. There's a sort of tactical side and there's a strategic side. The strategic is the first 4, right? They're really the kind of the higher level activities and plans that help you prevent unlawful conduct. You've got your risk management, you've got your knowledge, you've got your leadership. The last 3 are more tactical. These kind of are important if something happens. How do we support? How do we report and respond? How do we monitor? So if we were looking at the strategic ones first, potentially, you happy to start there?
Yeah, let's start with strategic and get an understanding of that.
So under the 4 strategic ones, there's leadership. And really that's about senior leaders being responsible for ensuring that the measures are developed and implemented, right? In a lot of the work, they refer to a prevention and response plan. So this is where that starts. Senior leaders need to review the effectiveness of these measures, and they need to keep everyone updated. And most importantly, I think they need to be a role model, right? Too often, these incidents happen, and this was happening in the consulting firms where the partners were the bullies, and that's not acceptable. So they need to be a role model. Then, if you move to the second one, which is culture, there's obviously a lot that could be discussed here, and there's a whole world of work culture, but there's a general goal of fostering a culture that's safe, respectful, and inclusive. It values diversity and gender equality. And, it doesn't, the irony, I'm not missing the irony, we've got two middle-aged men here discussing this, but, we've been blessed in past, and I think it's our responsibility to really drive through diversity and equality and to build a culture that empowers everyone to report unlawful contact, to hold people accountable if they breach that.
And I think that varies depending on the industry as well. I say what varies, not the actual standard itself, but how much of a shift that's going to require in each organization.
Yeah.
Where, as you said, you mentioned, the consulting firms and other organizations, government particularly, where this has been a concern for a long time. So building that psychological safety within the organization is going to take a lot more than in those industries than, others or other organizations where they have been taking a positive step.
It's true, and potentially the more male-dominated industries, defense is an example, mining are examples of ones that do have those problems. But I did read another interesting article about nurses in the healthcare. And believe it or not, they were working in a mental health area of healthcare, and they were still experiencing bullying. So it's certainly not, limited to any one industry or sector.
No.
So then the third standard is knowledge. And this is really, what a lot of people think about. Traditionally, when you talk about sex discrimination, it's the policies and the training. You need to define expectations, standards, and consequences around sexual harassment and discrimination. The training programs to educate employees about their rights, their responsibilities, and the importance of having that workplace culture. So I think a lot of HR practitioners are kind of familiar with that area. So probably I won't talk about it more. The last one in what I would think of as the four strategic standards is the risk management one. And risk management is probably not my area of expertise, but this is where people are taking a risk-based approach, or you're encouraged to take a risk-based approach to prevention and response. So you're identifying and assessing the risks of unlawful conduct and its impact. And you're implementing and reviewing your control measures like any other risk mitigation. And I do a lot of work for finance and banking. Obviously, risk is a huge area there, whether it's financial risks or compliance risks. This is another one that must be taken into consideration.
Yeah, risk is a good way to approach this sort of thing. It on the surface, that risk-based approach can seem quite cold and unhuman for such a human context that we're looking at reviewing, but it allows you to take that step back, particularly if you can get some help, some external help potentially to give you that perspective that, see the things that you can't see. But taking that risk-based approach allows you to really step back and look at, well, what are the potential things that could happen, allows you to really scope out what those risks are so that you can avoid it. It is, essentially risk-based approach is the cornerstone to that proactive approach. They're one and the same. Talk to me now about the tactical standards. How are they different?
Yeah. And look, what you said was right. And the risks are not small. The financial penalties, but the reputational damage as well. You think some of the consulting companies would be better at their risk assessment. I think now, because the risks have become greater, we really do need to do that risk approach that says we can't live with this kind of culture anymore. Moving on to the tactical stuff, though. So the three in here are support, reporting and response, and the monitoring, evaluation, and transparency. The support is pretty much what it says. It's about making sure that you've got the assistance and help available to people who experience or even witness unlawful conduct. People need to know that the support's there, they can access it, and they need to be able to access it regardless of whether they report unlawful conduct or not. Because sadly, and this is one of the biggest problems, most people like the vast majority, I've heard 90% of people who experience unlawful conduct at work do not report it. So what we do know is the tip of the iceberg. Therefore, you've got to make sure that people can get support even if they don't choose to report. But reporting is important. And reporting and response is really where RepSafe comes in. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk with you guys. So reporting is all about ensuring that there are appropriate options for reporting incidences and managing the responses to those incident reports in a consistent and timely way. Also, while minimizing any further harm. So one of the big problems is people who report things can get harmed further. So here the standard is seeking to ensure that the reporting and response is appropriate, including that the consequences for unlawful acts are consistent and proportionate. This is where the Respect at Work website, when their good reporting framework, could be really useful. It's another link that I'll make sure is in the episode notes. They provide some practical guidance on establishing a good practice reporting framework based on 9 key principles. Now, I'm not going to go into those, but they're all around access and so on. So I do want to come back to reporting because I think for me this is a key one. If we don't know what's going on, we can't measure it, we can't address it. The last of the standards flows on from this because it's around monitoring, evaluating, and transparency. So it's about collecting data to understand what's going on. These could be reports that have been submitted, but it could even be a pulse survey. When I've talked to people about the RepSafe tool, they go, that's not great, not only great for reporting an unlawful incident, but what happens if we want to know something good that's happened? Well, that's what you're gathering that data, monitoring the data to understand what's going on, using that data, evaluating and using that data to improve your workplace culture and prevent incidents in future. And transparency. So this one's an interesting one. I mean, transparency should really be everywhere, but it's all about using the data de-identified. Okay? I'll come back to privacy and security in a minute, but de-identified data to keep people informed. What are the trends? What are the patterns? What are the lessons we need to learn? So those are the 3 tactical standards, at least in very short order.
And with that transparency, is it something is there an expectation of transparency back to a government reporting agency, or is it just internal transparency that's required?
Yeah, look, I think at this point there is no agency that's collecting that data that I'm aware of. Obviously, they do their own surveys, but it's definitely for internal use. But good reporting and good data would be something that you'd want to let people know about as well.
Yeah.
So, it will improve your reputation rather than damage it.
Yeah, so you're mentioning the online solutions for reporting and monitoring. Obviously, RepSafe is one example of that. My instinct might be to use some of the tools that I've already got, whether that's a Google form, maybe an existing survey tool that I've got, such as SurveyMonkey or equivalent, or perhaps a survey tool that's embedded within my HRIS that I have already, my HR platform. And that's not to say that those tools aren't fit for those purposes. They're great as survey tools. But what are some of the things that I need to consider when looking for a technology solution to this aspect, specifically around reporting as well?
Yeah. And now we're getting into my comfort zone. I mean, I did do a law degree, but I've been working in technology since, I won't go that far back. And I have sold and used, almost every HRIS system out there. And look, the advice I'd give it doesn't matter if you came to me and said, I need a new ERP or I need a new CRM or I need a whatever. I would always say, first of all, whatever you're looking at, make sure you get something that's built for purpose. So, in short form, do not use Google Forms or SurveyMonkey forms, right? These are not secure enough. And actually, they could do more harm than good. So the Human Rights Commission research found that some of the conventional approaches for gathering incident reports, unlawful conduct reports, like, for example, employee assistance programs relying on that, or a phone hotline or standard web form, they just don't cut the mustard. They are ineffective. They are not trusted by staff. And in fact, they may even damage the victim further because they can limit the reporting cycles. If I have to talk to a person, we do everything on our phone right now, but I have to call up someone to report this, limits the reporting channels, often requires an excessive level of information. Too much information is required. It can't be anonymous. And it can even prevent people from reporting things earlier so that you can do your informal intervention. Because a lot of this proactive requirement is not to have to do something afterwards, but if you're hearing stories, you can start doing informal interventions before things get worse.
Mm.
So I would look for a SaaS solution to begin with, right? We're in the SaaS age right now. You don't need to set up your own infrastructure. You don't need to update the software. Get a SaaS solution. SaaS solutions generally are you kind of here's what you get, but make sure you can customize it. So you might want to put content in, your company's policies. You might want to change the reporting questions. You might want to modify the dashboard. Whatever you're looking at, make sure it's SaaS, but you can customize to the degree you need. I would definitely recommend looking for something that's built and hosted in Australia. It's going to be more suitable for Australian needs, but it's also going to be helping with your data security. You don't want this data going offshore. It's incredibly private. And it should go without saying, accessibility, user friendliness, those are really key for any software. Desktop and mobile channels have to be supported. And then if you think about the functionality, what does this software have to do? It's really three things. And it goes back to those three tactical standards. I need to offer support information to people, even if they don't make a report. So that's the support standard. I want people to easily make a report, and I want my HR team to respond appropriately through this system. That's the report and respond standard. It's also why Google Forms don't work, because yes, you might be able to make a report, but is there the tools for HR to classify it, to investigate it, to take it through for reporting? Which of course leads to the third one. You want good reporting dashboards so that your leaders can look at the trends based on that de-identified data, and that's that transparency standard. Now, we've talked around it a couple of points, but I really want to make this really clear. The Australian Human Rights Commission and Respect at Work, they all emphasise that confidentiality, anonymity, and the protection of privacy is the core. It must be the core of any reporting and data collection, because you've got to ensure that staff are not at further risk of harm or retaliatory action by doing this. So with that in mind, I would really emphasize the importance of finding a solution that has strong encryption. And that's in transit as you're sending the reports across, but also at rest. And it's not enough just to encrypt the database and then when someone logs in, they see the decrypted version, because that password may not be secure. Right? It might be a shared password. There actually needs to be an extra step, I would argue, that says I might be able to log into the back end and see the leadership dashboard, but if I need to get to the sensitive part of a report, I'll need to decrypt that with a two-factor or some other form of authentication. Now, the systems also need to support that formal or named report, but informal or anonymous reporting. And I talk to a lot of HR people, this starts to give them the heebie-jeebies, right? Anonymous reporting can be used against people. And that's true, right? But the research and everything I've learned says that the benefit of anonymous reporting far outweighs the risk, because it encourages victims who may fear victimization or traumatization that comes from the investigation process, but still helps you know what's going on, measure what's going on, right?
And I think if you've had, if
Of
anyone's actually jumped in and tried to do an engagement survey within an organization, you've had this experience as well. You've tried to, I'm working with a client, trying to convince them, their people, that yes, the survey is going to be anonymous, it's going to be safe, and there was a fear that they were using their own tools. So we took that next level. We said, cool, that's okay. We're using our tools, but here's all the steps we're taking to make sure the data is anonymous. And there was still that level of skepticism on the employee. It was like, yeah, but what if someone was able to get into the back end? Our developers have access to the code of the system. Maybe you could go in and crack the egg there. Or, there's always that need to develop psychological safety within a workplace broadly. But when it comes to reporting, particularly in this kind of sensitive issues, it's really important to not only create that psychological safety so they feel safe, but actually ensure it from a technological standpoint, that, as you said, the encryption, the multiple levels and layers to make sure that data is locally hosted and stored here in a way that can't be accessed by just about anyone, and protects that anonymity, as a priority.
And that actually brings to mind two thoughts that I wanted to probably finish on. The first is this is one of the reasons why a built-for-purpose standalone system makes sense, right? It's an independent thing, right? That independent thing has its own security that you can then say, anyone go here and look and learn more about the tool we use. Right? We didn't build it ourselves. This comes from someone that's trusted to do this. It's also one of the reasons why IT teams, and I've worked for companies that sold integration software, right? I come from that background. And IT teams love integration, right? Because it means they can connect it in, you can single sign on, we can get the data flowing. But you do not want that. If you really want true anonymity and privacy, this is really one of those cases where you want a standalone system. You don't want it integrated. It's also why you really shouldn't use your HR system for this sort of reporting, because you just can't be sure that it's truly anonymous. We have had clients who said, look, but hang on, I don't want anyone from the public to be able to get here. Traditionally you might have a QR code up on a workplace flyer or send it out via email. But what happens if it gets into the public? What stops someone from the public going to make a report? So, the most integration you'd ever probably want to do is that the employee might log into their computer or to their intranet, and they're issued a digital token, which, when they go to the reporting tool, which is hosted somewhere else, it confirms that this person is an employee, they're a stakeholder, and they can get to the site, but there's no identifying information in that token. So we still don't know who they are if they wish to remain anonymous. And so integration actually is a problem that doesn't need to be solved if you're dealing with workplace incident reporting. You don't want to make it integrated. You just shouldn't.
Yeah, which goes against what I guess the standard is for technology. That's one of the first things you look to is, does it integrate into my existing ecosystem, existing network? But yeah, that increase your risks of identification. So the further apart you can have it, the better.
Yeah, exactly.
Before we wrap up, any final thoughts from your perspective, Tim, on how you think this is going to impact our workplace moving forward?
Look, I have some thoughts, but honestly, it's still very early days. The law only changed 8 months ago. There's still a grace period, although honestly, I don't think Australian companies are moving fast enough to address this. So that, for me, is one of the things that I'm concerned about. And I still think there's a lot. There are more horror stories to come out. Right? I think we're still going to hear about things happening in workplaces which are not acceptable. I'm concerned that Australian companies aren't taking enough action right now, and that someone is going to be held liable. And maybe when that happens, then you'll see a movement of people to take steps, because you only need one or two companies being held liable and fined multi-million dollars for this to become suddenly a board level concern. But look, the positive duty is a really important step, and it is a timely call for everyone, and not just HR, right? We all have a responsibility to deliver that kind of culture that we all want to work in, that we want our kids to work in, that leads to a positive and inclusive environment. And I think the standards that I've talked about, the technologies I've talked about, are part of that. And I really do hope that as a country and as practitioners, we can use this to make better workplaces for all of us.
Fantastic, Tim. Well, it's been really insightful and really helpful to understand the background, how we got to where we are, and where we're going on this really important matter. So thanks so much for taking the time out today and joining us on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. It was wonderful.
This episode is supported by RepSafe. RepSafe is a safe and anonymous reporting tool designed specifically for Australian organisations. RepSafe enables employees and stakeholders to report incidents securely and confidentially, whether identified or anonymous. Thanks to the team at RepSafe for their support.